I think it is clear to believe in the power of ideas.
Fresh thinking of the Manhattan Institute.
I'm Howard Hughes. I'm Vice President for Policy Research here at the Manhattan Institute, and welcome to our conference today, Power 2012, Keeping the Lights On, What Role for Coal and Nuclear? It's my privilege to introduce a number of Manhattan Institute events, and it's a privilege which prompts me sometimes to reflect on what, given their great range of subject matters, do they have in common? And this morning's event prompts just such a question. Why would an institution best known for our work on cities, how to make them work, how to make them thrive, sponsor a conference on electricity? Well, there are a number of answers to that question. Cities such as New York, we've come to understand, are the most efficient users of power. And at the same time, it goes almost without saying that cities such as this one must have that power to continue to thrive. And anyone who has visited the developing world and spent time in a city where electricity is intermittent or non-existent knows how true this is. So, the link between power and economic growth, that brings us to the work of the person who has been the guiding force behind today's conference, our senior fellow, Robert Bryce, of our Center for Energy Policy and the Environment. At a time when so much of the discussion about electricity and its sources focuses on unproven and intermittent power sources such as wind and solar, Mr. Bryce reminds us consistently in his work that economic growth depends, in his words, on power that is cheap, abundant, and reliable. He's quick to point out that public policies which run counter to those goals also run counter to employment and prosperity. This is among the themes he draws from the data compiled for his latest report for the Institute's Center for Energy Policy. It's entitled The High Cost of Renewable Electricity Mandates. It's included in your materials this morning, and I commend it to you. I'd also like to recognize a young man who helped Robert in the research of that report, Chris Peterson, now with the Canadian Council, who's here with us this morning too. In the report, Robert concludes that those states which have adopted so-called renewable electricity standards have not compared the costs of doing so to any serious measure of benefits and are, as a result, not surprisingly, pushing electric rates higher at a time when our economy remains, at best, fragile. But if one agrees on the importance of power that is, in Robert's words, cheap, abundant, and reliable, how can we best be sure that we'll have it? In today's conference, organized by Mr. Bryce, we focus on facts, not fancy, on the actual sources of a new electricity capacity on which we might best rely, both here in the United States and around the world. To help us understand which power sources can most practically undergird our economy, Robert has brought together accomplished professionals, officials, and scholars whom he will introduce and whose discussion he'll guide. First, a brief introduction of Robert himself. He's been writing about energy issues for about 2 decades, and he's the author of 4 books, including in 2008, Gusher of Lies, The Dangerous Delusions of Energy Independence, which prompted the New York Times to call him something of a visionary and perhaps even a revolutionary. The Wall Street Journal described his 2010 book, Power Hungry, The Myths of Green Energy and the Real Fuels of the Future, quote, precisely the kind of journalism we need to hold truth to power. And the Washington Times called it a magnificently unfashionable, superlatively researched new book that dares to fly in the face of all current conventional wisdom and cant. Please join me in welcoming our conference organizer and today's moderator for our program now, Robert Bryce.
Thank you. Good morning. Okay, quick pop quiz. Which country over the past 10 years has had the biggest percentage growth in CO2 emissions? Anyone? China's a good guess. India's not a bad guess. Vietnam. Which country over the last 10 years has had the biggest percentage growth in coal consumption? China's a good guess. It's wrong. Vietnam. Which country over the last 10 years has had the biggest percentage growth in electricity generation? You all learned quick. Well, Vietnam stands, I believe, as a proxy for the larger issues globally that we are looking at in terms of providing electricity. And that is the essential question. The essentiality of electricity to modernity is incontrovertible. The countries that can provide cheap, abundant, reliable electricity are the ones that can bring their people out of poverty and into the modern world. And those that can't, can't. Full stop. So, and further, that electricity use, and IEA data shows this, between 1990 and 2010, global electricity use increased by 76%. That's faster than any other form of energy. It's twice as fast as the growth in oil consumption during that time period, and far faster than the growth in coal and natural gas. And the IEA's latest data predicts that electric demand will continue growing by as much as 80% over the next 2 decades. And one of the motivating bits of information for this conference, it's in your packet. We reprinted the IEA's medium-term coal report that came out in December, and it's this slide. It's the third slide in that slide deck, and it shows that over the last decade, global coal demand has increased as much as global oil, natural gas, and nuclear combined. Now, when you consider that and you look at how this demand is going to continue growing, in fact, over the next 2 decades, this is a compelling story, and it's one that is, in fact, a global issue, particularly if we're going to deal with CO2 emissions. And this is all, of course, relevant directly here to New York. The mayor of the city of New York, Mayor Bloomberg, has committed tens of millions of dollars to the Sierra Club to help them in their anti-coal campaign. Further, we have the governor of the state, Governor Cuomo, who is advocating the closure of Indian Point, the nuclear reactor here in Westchester County. It has about 2,200 megawatts of capacity and provides as much as 25% of the city's electricity. So clearly, coal and nuclear are directly relevant to the city of New York and further to the entire world. So that's a brief introduction. I'm thrilled to be here. I've obviously been planning this conference for some time, but thrilled to have the panelists that we have here today. I'm going to jump right into it. I'm not going to give a long introduction to the panelists. All their bios are in your packets, but I'm very pleased to introduce a gentleman I met last September when I was in Paris, Laszlo Varro. He's the head of the Gas, Coal, and Power Markets Division at the International Energy Agency. And Laszlo, if you please, you're going to come up here. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Robert. Ladies and gentlemen, a couple of remarks on the role of coal and nuclear power generation. They have a common similarity, which are that these are both capital-intensive baseload power generation technologies, but they have also, of course, a very, very large difference, is that they are in the 2 opposite scales of the carbon intensity scale. Nuclear is a low-carbon power generation form, whereas unless you are extremely optimistic about carbon capture and storage, which I'm not, then coal is a very carbon-intensive electricity generation source. So in a sense, their fates are diverging, because any meaningful projection or scenario for a low-carbon energy system includes an expansion of nuclear power. In fact, in our 450 ppm scenario, which as the name suggests is a projection where we reach globally a 450 ppm climate stabilization, for nuclear that is equivalent to roughly 100 nuclear power plants under construction in any given moment of time around the world for 25 years. I think it's fair to say that we are not on track for that. And I should also say that we were not on track even before Fukushima. So I think I actually think that the nuclear industry is deluding itself if they claim or if they complain that this is all because of Fukushima. Of course, Fukushima didn't happen. That's absolutely clear. First of all, it didn't happen in Japan. I mean, Japan was a country which, up until the day of the Fukushima disaster, was enthusiastic about nuclear power. Several nuclear power plants were under construction, and the Japanese government envisaged a very large-scale ramp-up of nuclear power in Japan. So this is unlikely to happen. In fact, as we speak, only 2 nuclear power plants are operating in Japan, and the incremental oil and gas imports which substitute for nuclear power, that's $100 billion per day burden on the Japanese economy right now. So Japan is the first country which is feeling the pinch from it. But outside Japan and also outside Germany is a very, very special case, and nuclear power was living on borrowed time in Germany even before Fukushima. But outside Japan and Germany, we still have a critical mass of countries which remained broadly politically supportive of nuclear power. That includes the United States, that includes France, UK, Central Eastern Europe, China, India, Russia, South Korea. However, now, there are countries like in Russia where if you have a broad political support from the president of Russia, that means that nuclear power plants will get built and nuclear power will get financed. But in economies which are based on privately owned utilities, there is a very, very large gap between the broadly supportive political attitude and the actual plant construction. And that has to do with the very special economics of nuclear power. The United States just launched the first new nuclear construction in 30 years, so the mood is optimistic. I have to say that if we meet, let's say, 6-7 years from now, and that plant in Georgia is completed on budget, on time, then I will eat my words and I will join the optimist camp. But the project management experience with nuclear construction is not terribly encouraging. In Europe, there are 2 major nuclear projects under construction. One in Western France by Electricity de France, which is the most experienced nuclear operator in the world. And the other is in Finland, which is an extremely well-functioning, well-organized, efficient, and not corrupt country. Both projects are a complete project management disaster. Now, and if you have a technology where you put in $10 billion in the beginning, for 10 years you only spend money, and then you get a fixed cash flow, actually a 1-year project delay wipes out 1/3 of the NPV of the project, because you have 1 more year of financing your capital, and you have your cash flow coming a year later. Now, a 1-year project delay is actually an extremely successful nuclear project if you have only 1 year project delay. By the way, if you have a lifetime of only 30 years instead of 50, that wipes out 2/3 of the NPV of the project. So if 30 years from now you get a government which will be against nuclear power, that can kill 2/3 of the NPV. So I would say that in countries which have privately owned utilities and competitive wholesale markets for electricity, nuclear will face very, very serious difficulties. And unless the broadly supportive political framework is accompanied by actual measures which will help the financing of nuclear power, and that, this can be very broad measures, and that could be a very interesting professional debate on whether it should be a credit guarantee, whether it should be a carbon price floor like in the United Kingdom, whatever, that the nuclear renaissance will not happen on its own. Now, coal is a different issue. And it's a very different issue in the West, in the industrialized countries, and in the Asian emerging market countries. For the United States, the mental image you have to conjure is Elvis Presley driving his red Cadillac with pintails. That was the time when the coal-fired power plants were built in the U.S. So a large coal-fired power plant fleet in the U.S. is actually over 50 years old. They will get out. If I take the current investment rate into new coal-fired power plants in the U.S., the steady-state equilibrium would be 1/4 of the current coal-fired power plant capacity. If you have an old fleet and you don't build new ones, your fleet will go down and down and down. With the current investment activity, the equilibrium will be 1/4 of the current level. This is probably due to a combination of factors, which include, First and foremost, shale gas. I think the competition from gas is the primary factor which hinders investment and deters investment in coal-fired power plants in the US. Second, all the licensing issues, all the environmental issues, which from a corporate finance point of view, you can translate it by saying that coal-fired power plants have a higher cost of capital. In Europe, interestingly, there is no shale gas revolution in Europe, so gas is 3 times more expensive. And consequently, despite the European emission trading system, coal is doing very fine, thank you very much. It's very profitable to burn coal. Twice as much coal-fired power plants are under construction in Europe right now than in the United States. For Europe, we project an increasing coal use until the end of the decade. For the United States, we project a declining coal use until the end of the decade. So in terms of climate change and carbon dioxide emissions, the US does not have a very good public relation, but the actual numbers are quite different. For the Asian emerging market countries, well, I mean, if you take the coal-fired power plants, which I would say have a future from a strategic sense, so large plants over 300 megawatts, less than 20 years old, United States has 20 gigawatts of those, China 480. And India is going to come in the next decade. So there is absolutely no doubt that we will see a very, very large, modern, efficient coal-fired power plant fleet in the Asian emerging market countries operating for decades to come. Now, how this will put us into a decarbonization pathway, that's a good question which I cannot tell you. So I think I will pass the floor to the other panelists.
Okay, great. Thank you, Laszlo. And now Jacob Williams. He's the Vice President for Global Energy Analytics at Peabody Energy. I met him in St. Louis last October and was fascinated by the discussion that we had about Peabody's plans to dramatically increase the amount of coal that they're exporting from Wyoming to China. So, Jacob, please.
Thank you. In terms of energy around the world, Robert did a great job of laying out some of the facts that those outside the U.S. would know, those inside the U.S. would ignore. Let me throw a couple other things on the table. Fastest growing energy source in the world, coal, 50% increase in the last 10 years. The next fastest growing energy source in the world was natural gas at 31%. Coal is 25% of the world's energy. It's not going away. And why is it not going away? Well, the reason it's not going away is because 2 billion people in the world today do not have electricity. 3.6 billion people in the world do not have adequate electricity. And their only hope of getting the scale of energy to meet their needs affordably, as Robert said, is coal. That note was profoundly hit home to me a year and a half ago. I was at a conference in Delhi, India. Keynote speaker, former CEO of Tata Steel. For those of you who don't know, Tata is one of the large national companies, probably one of the largest national companies in India. And a minute into his speech, I'm one of the 5 Americans in a room of 300 people from around the world. And he goes, how dare the United States intervene at the World Bank to stop the funding of a coal plant in India when 1/3 of the people in India do not have electricity. And the only hope we have for getting them electricity in the scale we need is by coal. That hit home, and that should tell you something. If you look at the statistics out there in the UN, you can use the UN statistics. Quality of life is rated, there's a human development statistic that the UN puts out. Quality of life is directly proportional, or not directly proportional. It grows, the electricity consumption grows by 10 times for every 10 years of increased life. As your quality of life goes up, you use far more electricity. If you look around the world, compare countries, and you will see that scale that's out there. And the only way to get that amount of electricity as you move up and across the scale is to use coal along with the other fuel sources. And there's some information in the packet that lays that out for you. And you think about it. What gives you the quality of life around the world? It is we have refrigeration so that we don't have to be in the hunter-gatherer mode every day. We have food that we can store for long periods of time. We have clean water. Sanitation, those things require energy, lots of it. Space conditioning, all your medical devices. Anybody know what an MRI is? That thing is a huge energy hog that's out there. It's a wonderful device, but it takes a lot of energy. The quality of life around the world is directly tied to how much energy you use. And that is what's going to continue to drive the consumption. The other misnomer that's out there is most people don't realize now China uses 3.5 times the amount of coal as the United States per year. In 2020, they'll use 5 times as much coal as the United States. China uses over half the coal in the world. And the reason their economy has grown at 10% a year over the last decade is because they've powered it using affordable electricity. And they'll continue to do that. Will they clean up their emissions? Yes. Their next 5-year plan has an improvement in their emissions. Do they have the equipment on those plants to do it? Surprisingly, yes, they do. They just don't turn them on. They're going to create an incentive to turn on the control equipment, much like we have in the United States. And now let's turn to the United States for a moment. United States, our coal fleet has went through an amazing transformation. We've reduced the emissions by 80%. At the same time, the consumption or the amount of electricity from coal plants is doubled or tripled, I should say, because of the control equipment's put on there. The United States has the toughest air regulations in the world, and for some reason, we seem to be disappointed. We've got the toughest air regulations in the world. Our plants are the cleanest in the world. It is the source of what is our low-cost electricity. If you look at a map of the United States, and there's one in the handout I've provided, you'll see states that have affordable electricity. If they have affordable electricity, it's because they have a large amount of coal generation in the states. The states that don't, the states in red, it's because they have very little coal electricity. It's fundamental. It is the affordable source. The only 3 outliers are the 3 states of the Pacific Northwest, and if you're blessed with that much hydro and snowfall, then lucky you. But for the rest of us, we don't quite have that in play. And if you look at going forward, the regs on the books, our fleet will continue to improve its emission profile and significant gains. You can have affordable electricity and have clean air. They're not mutually exclusive. And yet there are many who give out the false choice that that is indeed not true. And we'll see in China over the next decade, there'll be improvements there. The air quality is not good today. It will improve. The equipment's on the plants. It's a matter of them turning it on and running it most of the time, and they're going to do that. So with that, I think I'll stop for now and leave open questions later.
Great. Okay. Thank you. Finally, Porter Bennett will just on the format here, he'll speak for about 5 or 7 minutes. We wanted to leave a lot of time for questions. We'll have some discussion among ourselves. I'll pose a few questions, but of course, we're eager to have questions from all of you and discussions. Porter Bennett is now the president of Ponderosa Advisors. He was a founder and a CEO of Bentech Energy, which a company that I learned about several years ago was one of the most and still remains one of the sharpest analytics firms in the U.S. in terms of energy flows and particularly natural gas. I've known Porter for about 3 years and is, in my view, probably the single most knowledgeable person about natural gas flows and natural gas markets here in the United States and around the world. So, Porter, please.
It's easy to pull the wool over his eyes. Yeah, I'm the gas guy. So I'm one of those guys that in the industry that's chewing on the coal industry on the sides and keeps thinking it's going to actually make some major inroads into the generation market, probably at coal's expense. So what I thought I'd do is the major determinant of that is price. So I thought I was going to focus here for a couple minutes on the price dynamics ahead of the natural gas industry for the next decade or two. Today, so far this year, coal or gas prices have averaged about $2.60 a million BTUs. They've been as low as $2.23. That is very low. As a result, we've seen power demand for generation or for gas and generation increase by almost 4 BCF a day. Pretty much at the expense of coal. And but the flip side of that is it's been very warm, as you know, and we've lost almost 9 BCF a day of load due to warm weather. So as a result, total demand is down by about 4 BCF a day. What's really interesting, and I thought I'd focus on here, is the supply side, because typically when prices get this low, the first thing you hear various people in the industry say is we're going to shut in gas, we're going to move rig counts and things like that. And as a result, you would expect production had declined. In fact, production is up about 6 BCF a day over what it was during the first part of last year. Now, a little bit of that 6 BCF a day is really false, because last year during the first 2 months of the year, there was some very cold weather in the Southwest and a lot of freeze-offs on wells and pipelines, so production was depressed a little bit during the first part of last year, so the increase is not real. But the point is production's up. So why is that? What's going on? What's driving that dynamic in the market? And there's really two factors. Number one is after spending the better part of a decade and a half trying to eradicate the concept of oil in the name of an oil and gas company, in the last 2 years, oil has become fashionable. And not only is it fashionable, it's quite profitable. If you look at the rig count right now, about 70% of the rigs are operating in areas of the country that produce liquids and oil, liquids, propane, butane, ethane, various NGLs. The 70% of the rig counts is in, or 70% of the rigs are in areas that produce those along with natural gas. The reason people are there, obviously, it's a more rewarding expenditure of your dollar. If you look at, say, just the Permian Basin, for example, you take a typical well there, it produces oil, natural gas, and liquids. Less than 3% of the revenue produced in that well, if today's prices maintain, will be associated with natural gas. So essentially, we're drilling for we're drilling for oil and liquids and getting natural gas, which is essentially a byproduct. So that puts the natural gas industry in much the same position as it's in the Mideast, that its future is really not dependent on the gas price, it's dependent on the oil price. And since the oil price isn't likely to decline anytime soon, the natural gas production is going to continue to rise. If you look at last quarter of last year, about 60, almost 70% of the incremental volumes that were produced in oil and liquids prone areas. So that, you know, in order for gas production to decline appreciably, you have to essentially stop all increases in dry gas areas, and then you've got to reduce it by about another 2.5 BCF a day in order to get gas production to actually decline overall in the U.S. I think the most likely scenario is you'll see the growth rate arrested a little bit, but it's not going to decline anytime soon, which creates its own little set of problems. You know, it starts with storage. Right now, our storage position, because we've been pulling substantially less out of storage than normal, we're set up to, with, I think the last number I saw was a little over 600 billion cubic feet more gas in storage than we had at this time, any time in our nation's history. And we're likely to end up with storage well over half full by the end of the withdrawal season. So sometime next fall, we're going to have some significant problems. So that's the first reason production isn't declining, and its prices are not having the normal impact on production that you would expect. The second is technology. One of the reasons, I was here a year ago and did a presentation on the role of technology in the natural gas industry, and I pointed out Southwest Energy is drilling a well today, and at that point it was used to be 20 days, then it was 8, now it's 5. It continues to decline, which means that the dollars expended on exploration become more efficient. You produce more with each drilling rig. That dynamic continues. You're going to see more and more of it, but it's also important to recognize it's not just on the exploration side. On the environmental mitigation side, many new developments are at work there. You're seeing an improvement in the ability to reduce water, for example, and obviously the fracking debate rages on, but it seems to be dissipating because people are beginning to realize the problem's not at the frack, the problem's on the surface with the way the chemicals are handled. So the point is between the movement to oil and liquids and then the role of innovation in the industry, I think you can expect to see gas prices stay pretty low. I don't think they'll stay where they are. They'll end up going up into the $3 to $4 range probably, but I suspect they'll hang there for a better part of the decade and perhaps well into the next decade, which sets up an interesting dynamic between coal and natural gas, because that's kind of, depending upon where you are, that's the boundary around break-even costs. So it'll set up for an interesting discussion. Sure. Okay?
Okay, great. Thank you, Porter. Well, I have a number of questions that, and look, I could talk about this stuff all day. I love this, but and we had a very interesting discussion over dinner last night. So, Laszlo, I'd be curious to see or hear your thoughts about how Porter's discussion of shale gas and the economics of shale gas, how does that play out in the EU now? How is the shale revolution in the United States and all of this low-cost gas coming into the U.S., how does that affect the economics of electric generation in the EU, and in particular countries like Germany, which now have said we're going to phase out nuclear? What does that mean broadly for the EU?
Well, it's I think there is a little appreciation in either Europe or in the United States how huge is the price differential in natural gas. At the International Energy Agency, we often criticize Russia for subsidizing domestic gas prices because that's a bad policy. Actually, the market price of gas in the United States now is lower than the regulated domestic price in Russia. In terms of energy values, gas in the US is cheaper than coal in China. So we are in a completely different economics for the United States. Now in Europe, where European gas supply is pretty much dominated by 3+1 major stakeholders. The three old are the Gazprom, are the Algerians, and Statoil, the Norwegians. The +1, the new one, is the Qataris. Now, out of that four, three of them, the Russians, the Algerians, and the Qataris, are on the record insistent on oil price indexation. The Norwegians are much better in public relations, but deep in their heart, they are very happy to have oil price indexation, of course. Now that is translated into a gas price level of somewhere between $10 to $15 per MBTU. The indexation formulas are quite different, and it's not a single formula. But at that gas price level, the economics completely changes. So at that price level, nuclear power is in the money easily. At that price level, the coal-fired power generation is a cash machine, even with having a carbon price on it. And at that gas price level, actually, the amount of additional subsidy that you need for renewables is not all that much. So one of the factors which make the renewable energy policies politically very, very resilient in Europe is that if gas is terribly expensive, and it's imported anyway, then giving a bit more subsidy so that you can have domestic wind power instead of Russian gas, that's a very reasonable thing. Now, of course, in the United States, where you need a very large subsidy for renewables, and you would replace a domestic resource, domestic shale gas, the political economy is different. But in Europe, the renewable policies are very much supported by the high cost of imported gas. Now, two things can happen. One is shale gas technology leaves the United States. Another is shale gas itself leaves the United States, and the United States starts to export gas. I actually believe that both of them will happen. The shale gas technology is now being very seriously looked at in a number of European countries. Poland is the key pioneer because Poland has a very unusual combination of a geology which is not as good as northern Texas, but reasonably fine. A political decision maker elite which has quite robust views on the dependency on Russia, and also an energy system which is predominantly based on coal, and it's squeezed by European climate policy. So that creates a very powerful push for Polish shale gas. If somebody can do it, Poland will. There is a large degree of skepticism about the environmental impacts of shale gas. You know, again, the public image of the oil and gas industry in Europe is much worse than in the United States. And the industry is not doing a good job in communication, I have to say that. But if Poland does it, that has the potential to transfer the situation. And as for gas exports, I mean, I share your bullish view on U.S. gas production or bearish view on U.S. gas prices. And at these price levels, I mean, LNG exports from the United States beat Russian gas hands down on the basis of prices. And then you don't even have to start the discussion of all the politics and energy security and dependency issues. Simply on the basis of prices, U.S. energy exports could easily beat Russian gas in Europe. So there is a very strong interest among the European utilities on U.S. shale gas, and I would expect that they would be very much interested in it.
Sure, Porter, go ahead.
I think the U.S. gas beats oil-indexed Russian gas in Europe.
Yes.
I think if one of the big differences between
Just interrupt, oil indexing means that the natural gas prices in Europe and many of the contracts there are tied directly to oil prices, which we don't have here in the United States. Sorry.
there are a couple significant kind of cultural factors that weigh into this, because European utilities are much more dependent on long-term contracts. About 70% of their total demand is met by contracts that are 5 to 20 years old, or have terms of 5 to 20 years. They're very reluctant to do anything that harms their suppliers that they've had for years, A, and B, to lose the security of that term deal. So there's an issue there that has got to be overcome. It reminds me of the way utilities bought natural gas in the early 80s in the U.S. It was the same kind of mindset. I think what ultimately changes it is the availability of low-cost gas elsewhere, which then puts competitive pressure on the market. And I think that over the next 5 years, you're going to see a whole lot more of that in Europe. If U.S. prices hold in that $3 to $4 range, you start to see significant exports out of the U.S. That will put pressure on, even more pressure. I think they're already under pressure. That'll put even more pressure on European utilities to start renegotiating seriously their contracts. Russia is not really inclined to do that. In fact, I got involved in a debate last week with a gentleman from Gazprom about this, and I mean, there's a lot of intransigence. They are not eager to change where they are, and I think it's going to take time, and it's going to be a fairly significant battle that the regulators are going to have to get involved in, even though the regulators today are not particularly inclined to see a change.
I'll just jump in with one quick comment, and it was one of your colleagues at the IEA, Laszlo, about 2 years ago, talked about the shale gas revolution in the United States and said that, and made the point that the U.S. is now what he called a virtual LNG exporter. Remember, it was just 3-4 years ago where the global markets were expecting a lot of liquefied natural gas would flow into the U.S. Well, that hasn't happened. So globally now there's much more LNG available, and in my view, this is incredibly positive for the global economy. This and really we've seen a fundamental change in the outlook globally in terms of energy, and a realization that not only is gas abundant globally, it's super abundant. But let me come back to you if I could, Laszlo. You spoke last night about what the effective carbon tax would have to be in the United States to equal the coal to gas switching that has already occurred here. And you mentioned the European trading scheme, the cap and trade system in Europe. Carbon tax there now is effectively $8.50, priced at $8.50 per ton. Could you just run those numbers again, please?
Sure. Sure. Again, the key there is gas, because one interesting and underappreciated fact that if you go from a conventional coal-fired power plant to a combined cycle gas turbine, the step in carbon dioxide emissions down is bigger than if you go from a combined cycle gas turbine to wind or solar power. If you go from coal to gas, you save something like 0.5 ton of carbon dioxide for every megawatt hour that you generate with gas instead of coal. If you go from gas to solar or wind, you save something like 0.35. So switching from coal to gas takes you more than halfway. Now, this is happening in the United States at zero carbon price. And I should emphasize that what we have seen so far is just a taste of things to come. For two reasons. One is that major utilities usually have medium-term contracts for coal. So an interesting thing will be that when these contracts run out, what will happen? And the other is that we have a massive fleet. I mean, the U.S. coal-fired power plant fleet, which is over 50 years old, that's actually equivalent to the German coal-fired power plant fleet. I mean, that's history. So another big question will be that when these power plants go out, will the replacement investment be coal or will the replacement investment be gas? Unless there is a big change in the economics, most of the replacement investment will be gas. So this coal to gas switch is going to happen big time in the US, even with a zero carbon price. But if you want, I took a look at your paper yesterday. I must say that your numbers are too optimistic, because if you have gas, if you have gas at the current US gas prices, you need $100 plus carbon price to go from gas to renewable energy. Just do a very quick math. I mean, at the current gas prices, you can get a combined cycle gas turbine for what, $50 per megawatt hour. So a wind power at 80 is a $30 premium, but you save only 0.35 tons per megawatt hour because gas has a low carbon intensity. So that puts you around $100 of carbon price. So in the US, you get a large abatement at zero price, and then but then you hit the wall. Whereas Europe is completely different because of the very expensive gas. You need a quite high carbon price to get coal to gas switch in Europe, and also a large part of the European coal-fired power generation is vertically integrated, so the companies own the open pit lignite mines. So what you see in the income statement as fuel cost is in reality depreciation and capital cost of the mining equipment. The true marginal cost is much lower. So you need a quite big carbon price to get coal to gas switch, much higher than the current ETS carbon price. But the cost differential between Russian gas at $100 per barrel oil price index contract and wind power is not all that big.
Let me jump in here. The one thing we have to keep in perspective, and I was in the utility business in the 90s, and the U.S. energy policy de facto wasn't stated, and Dave, you can correct me if I'm wrong, was low-cost gas, $2 to $3 forevermore, and no transmission built, and it's all local generation. And then we went through gas at $8, $10, $12, $15 and whatnot. Now we're the shale play. You got to realize that $4.50 gas, coal's the winner in the U.S. So to sit out there and say gas is forevermore going to be the leading baseload source is interesting to say the least. The other thing you have to remember, again, let's do the price relationships. U.S. gas is $2.50. European gas is $10. Asian natural gas is $15 to $17. Do you think we're going to keep drilling for gas and trying to sell it in the U.S. at $3 or $4 when the world market is 10 and 15? The answer is no. Just like we don't drill for oil and sell it for $30 here or in other places, we get the world price. And the LNG market will become a world market here very soon over a 5 to 10 year period. Not tomorrow, because we can't export tomorrow. But over a 10-year period, it's going to be a world market, and there's going to be world market prices. And so your energy policy balance will start to balance out. In Europe and around the world, coal is clearly the low-cost fuel for power generation. In the U.S., there is a temporal factor in play because we can't export natural gas meaningfully right now. That will change 5 years from now. The LNG terminals will be built. I know there'll be some permitting hassles, but before it's all said and done, they'll be built, and you won't have $3 natural gas going forward in the U.S. if you got a world market that'll pay 10, 12, 15 bucks.
Jacob,
I got to
go ahead.
make a comment. I'm not sure that the U.S. ties into the global market for natural gas in the next 5 years. I think that's a little bit of a stretch. It may be 10, maybe 10, but I'm kind of a little bit dubious of that even. We'll have 2 to 3 BCF a day of export capacity out of the U.S. and another 2 to 3 out of Canada in 5 years, maybe. And that's not enough to affect the market here, and it's not really enough to affect the market anywhere else. What it does, I think the more significant point, which is kind of, it's saying the same thing in a different way, is that to me it's what happens to manufacturing and the energy consumption side of the world if you have the U.S. that's got an energy cost dramatically lower than Europe or Asia, which we're headed for that reality. And it's because of coal and natural gas. It's not just natural gas that's causing that, and it's in spite of our renewable investments. And I think that's really the question that will really drive a lot of the change that goes on around the world, where you'll start to see more shorter-term contracts for supply and gas. The interest in coal is going to be sparked by the need to compete with the U.S. on an energy basis, and that's really the lowest cost way to do it, particularly in many places.
You're saying then that manufacturers, China elsewhere, will then have to continue burning coal in order to compete with low-cost energy in the U.S. manufacturing sector.
I think that's part of it, but you're also going to see the export a lot of the oil and gas shale exploration methods in these areas, and I suspect you'll see a whole lot, by 2025, you will see a whole lot more natural gas produced, and I wouldn't be at all surprised to see a lot more oil produced as well than we have, than anybody expects right now, and it'll be in places that we really don't even know it exists. Because of the realities of the exploration transformation that's gone on in the last 5 years.
Let me just jump in for one. I think this is a critically important point, and even the fact that we're now discussing LNG export from the United States is a complete turnaround from 3 to 4 years ago, where we were, Cheniere Energy being the prime example, a Texas-based company, built an LNG receiving terminal. Now they just received a commitment of funding from BlackRock for $2 billion. They expect a $5 billion investment for LNG export. So this is a tremendous turnaround. And go ahead.
It's Blackstone, not BlackRock.
Blackstone,
the guys
sorry.
At Blackstone would get upset with that.
Sorry. I get my yeah, never mind. But let me turn to Jacob for a moment and preface it by looking at just last month, BP released their energy outlook, and it has a small table in there where they show the share of primary fuel globally from 1990 through 2030. And in 1990, they show coal at 27.3%. In 2030, they show it at 27.7%. The implications, as I said in my opening remarks, for this persistence of coal are enormous. But Jacob, I wanted you to walk us through the economics of exporting a very heavy fuel, carbon-heavy fuel. That how do you make the economics of that work from Wyoming to China? Because this still fascinates me, and it involves freight rates, global ocean-going freight rates. But please,
sure. Well, let me give you a little perspective. Back in I guess it would have been 2010, we probably exported 82 million tons of coal out of the U.S., and if you go back to 7 or 6, it would have probably been around 50 million. So we're growing. Last year, we exported 108 million tons of coal out of the U.S. So in a period of a few years, we've doubled the export, and we're going to continue to grow that. And the reason being is that some of the U.S. coals are very competitive now in the world market. And let's take the Powder River Basin, Wyoming. The Powder River Basin is unique in the world in its low-cost source of energy. If you ever have a chance to go out and see what essentially going for a 70 to 100-foot seam of coal in an earth-moving exercise and loading it in rail cars that essentially do not stop, you're getting energy at, call it 20 cents a million BTU or something akin to that before you put in taxes and all the other stuff. Amazingly low-cost operation. And then you can put it on rail cars, and we are now moving this coal to the West Coast, up to Canada, and exporting as much as we can into China. The dilemma is that we don't have enough terminal space in Canada and the West Coast, and that's in Canada is tied up to move metallurgical coal. Metallurgical coal prices at 3 times essentially the world market for thermal coal. Metallurgical coal is what you use to make steel. And the steel consumption in China is out of this world, and so they've driven that up. So it gets priority because it's so valuable, but what's ever left over is now we're moving Powder River Basin coal, this low BTU coal, around the world. And you go, how can that happen today? And the reason it is because global freight rates, the dry bulk freight market, is 50% of what it was 3-4 years ago. And you go, so why is that occurring? We're moving more commodity around the world than we did. The answer is we've been on a record pace of building ships over the last 3 or 4 years. We added 40% capacity in the last 2 years. We're going to add another 30% to that capacity going forward. And it's a strategy of a couple major commodity players to drive the freight rates as absolutely low as they can. Give you a story. Vale, the Brazilian iron ore manufacturer or miner, their market is China. Their competitors are in Australia. They have to lower freight rates to be competitive. So they're building what's called China-Max ships, 400,000-ton ships, double the Cape ships that are normally in the iron ore market. They built 22 of them to try to lower the cost of moving freight. So all this extra capacity is coming in to the point that where these bulk commodities are moving at very low cost now around the world. That's why U.S. coal that would have been unthinkable to put into a lot of markets is now competing. We're moving coal from Illinois down the Mississippi River to India now. We're moving coal out of Wyoming, running trains across the western half and sending it to China. If we had more capacity in the West Coast, we'd send far more of it. We just don't have it. That's why we're trying to permit new terminals to actually move it. And the market will only continue to grow. The other thing you got to remember, China's currency appreciation, if it continues to appreciate even at, call it 4% a year, very nominal. You know, we say China, you know, many of the policymakers say the currency is undervalued, but if they allow it to slowly appreciate, plus their cost structure, in 5 years, you're looking at a 20% change in that currency rate. That's a tremendous change in what they can pay for coal, and it's the same cost to them because of the currency appreciation. So we're set to see us become major exporters of coal, double what we do now in the next, easily in the next 7 years.
So remind me, aren't the largest American aircraft carriers about 100,000 tons? I think they're on that. I think they're on that order. So these new China-Max are 400,000 tons.
Yes.
These are enormous vessels. So we have about 20 more minutes. I'd like to open the floor up for questions. We have a microphone here. Please wait for the mic, and if you don't mind, introduce yourself and just briefly introduce yourself and get to the question. Thank you. Debbie? Or you have the mic, right?
You direct who?
Oh, I have to pick someone, don't I? I'm sorry. Alex, right there next to you. Thank you.
Hi, Alex Epstein, Center for Industrial Progress. I'm curious how the developments in coal and gas prices apply to coal to liquids and gas to liquids, and what the implications of that would be.
I'll throw that to you, Jacob.
I think obviously with the low-cost gas in the U.S., any of the coal to natural gas makes no sense at all, you know, in the near term. I don't think that the current economics in Poland, their mining costs are not low enough to probably support anything coal to natural gas. The major players in the coal to liquids are really the Chinese because they don't have enough oil. And so they look at it going straight coal to liquids. They're the biggest player in the game in that right now. But certainly in the U.S., all of that is put on the drawing or put to the side. They're actually looking at some projects in the U.S. that are coal to liquids, but it's more research effort than I would say than trying to make money at it.
On the gas to liquids front, there are at least 2 projects I know of up in Wyoming that are probably better than 50-50 likelihood of ultimately being built, at least in a significant commercialization test, I guess is the best way to put it. And that's because the gas to moving gas from its value, as we've said, real low to the vice of diesel, which is the target liquid. I mean, that's an arbitrage opportunity that's pretty compelling. So that I think you'll see a lot of move in that direction if the differentials stay where they are.
Porter, I just want to follow up one thing. The key thought here, there's a key thought. We always talk about coal displacing or natural gas displacing coal. The prize is natural gas displacing oil. Oil is at $20 a million BTU. Why you're chasing a $2 to $3 million BTU with a $3 to $4 million, it makes no sense. The value is just displacing oil ultimately.
And I think that's one of the reasons why you'll see more and more natural gas-fired vehicles in one form or another. One of the really interesting companies that I've seen lately is a service company in Denver that is looking to develop LPG technology on their converting drilling rigs to use LPG, and then they're converting all their compression trucks. All of their vehicles will be gas-fired probably within a couple of years. And that technology, that concept is moving into the mainstream in the industry, and I suspect that you'll see a whole lot less diesel used in this industry as well as the agricultural industry over the next few years. And that competition, as Jacob said, between gas and liquids is a very significant arbitrage, and that will motivate a lot of investment.
I'm absolutely convinced that gas will get to the transportation sector and will start to punish oil. But I think it's going to be a very interesting competition, whether it will be in the form of liquids, in gas to liquids, or whether it will be in the form of directly going to the vehicles. Because, I mean, a GTL facility can cost you $10 billion easily. All sorts of things can go wrong operationally, so the experience is so that these are very, very complex facilities. There are very, very big water needs, which can be problematic in certain parts of the world. On the other hand, you get very, very high quality middle distillates, the most valuable part of the barrel. Whereas you don't need anything special for going directly for the vehicle stock, but you need to change the vehicle stock, which takes time and take institutional arrangements. But it's going to be an interesting competition between these two.
I'll just add one quick point, and that is that this is the killer app, converting relatively low-cost coal or natural gas into high-value motor fuel. That's the killer app. Sasol, the South African company, has announced a prospect of building a gas-to-liquids plant in southern Louisiana, but the problem is the cost. Their initial estimate was a 90,000 barrel per day refinery, and the capital cost was $9 billion. So it's an enormously expensive process. And finally, just to build on Porter's point, there are companies based out of Austin, I live in Austin, Texas, that are talking about using liquefied natural gas in their fracturing operations. So you have to understand all the drilling operations are diesel fueled, and their diesel costs are enormous. They're talking tens of thousands of gallons per rig, and these fracture spreads, or they call them frac spreads in the business, they're running to have enough power to fracture the rock. These are 10, 12, 14,000 horsepower that they're running for days at a time. So if they can produce low-cost LNG and displace diesel, they can save a lot of money. Who's next? David was here in the front. Thank you.
Hi, David Moeller from Duke Energy. I just want to take the conversation into the light vehicle transportation fleet for a minute. And frankly, I want to test my back of the envelope thinking with you experts up there. Here's the back of the envelope thinking. If I were going to use natural gas to drive a light vehicle transportation fleet, why wouldn't I burn it in a combined cycle electric plant at 50% or better efficiency, and then use it to charge a vehicle and drive it with electricity? Because, along the line, I'm going to lose maybe another 10 to 20%. But the current internal combustion efficiency for natural gas is on the order of 20%. So on a pure energy basis, I'm ahead of the game if I burn the gas in a combined cycle plant and then use it to charge a vehicle.
Battery.
Yes.
Battery.
Yep.
Are you talking about capital cost?
A
Yes.
battery.
Yes.
It is the battery that is the stop. You get 40 to 60 miles on a car. and the weight of the battery and all that. Have you seen the sales of the Volt lately? It's all about the battery.
No, if you go, I mean, if it depends on what is the target that you optimize for. I mean, if you optimize on carbon dioxide emissions, there is absolutely no doubt that you burn it in a combined cycle gas turbine and you kick off coal. That's the optimal thing. In fact, if you wanted to do a cost-efficient climate policy, then in the first decade you didn't do much. You wouldn't do much with the light vehicle stock, because there the cost of cutting emissions in light vehicles is very, very high. That's not the low-hanging fruit.
Yeah, I don't know whether I'd call myself a typical consumer, but I'm not a patient guy. And for me to drive an electric vehicle, I would go absolutely flipping nuts. And if you put the natural gas vehicles can perform at a level that is close enough to a gasoline liquid hydrocarbon engine that there's really no comparison between the two. It all boils down to, in order to sell these things, they got to actually work in a way that is useful to customers, and the electric vehicle is not there yet.
Well, I'll just make one quick comment. That is, the electric car is the next big thing, and it always will be.
Yeah.
There's one right here.
Hi there. It's Miles Weigel with Argus. If the panel could explore a little bit more domestically here in the U.S., the coal versus nat gas switching. And you know, this idea of switching does not happen on a daily basis. We have to think strategically. So I've heard here really from Porter that the gas climate is we're going to be flooded with gas from the fracking world. I've heard from Laszlo that even though there's economics outside of the United States of compelling gas differentials that would drive a growth engine of LNG exports, but let's think about what happened a decade or two ago when all the utilities rushed to the natural gas world, right? Everyone built all the gas generation fleets. We ran out of cheap natural gas, back into the coal world again. What's going to happen? Perhaps a gentleman from Duke can also address it here, where everyone's exiting from building that next coal plant here, but you know, we're in a world here where nat gas and fracking could change that whole world. Focus on the U.S.
Let me take a shot at it. I came out of a utility background, so I ran a generation portfolio that had gas, coal, and all that. And believe it or not, you actually can make they not only can, they do make those decisions daily, because you have plants that use natural gas, plants that use coal. You can dispatch on the daily economics. They're done every day, and they bid in, etc. So there is some of those switching. Now, the change can't be made overnight, because contractually, if I committed to a 1-2 year take-or-pay coal/rail contract, I can't step out of it. So in some cases, I've got to run it or write a big check to get out of it. So there's some limitations there. The other piece is how much extra gas is currently being produced. And if you said, pick your number, how much extra do you think's out there? Is it 4, 5, 6 BCF available? You do the math, you get to a number that's anywhere between 80 to 100 million tons of, 80 to, at top end, 140 million tons of coal that can be displaced currently under the current profile, depending on your fuel source. And so there's a limitation currently that's going on. Now, Porter will say, well, we're going to grow natural gas more and more and more. That may be true.
Well, I think it's worth keeping in mind that the share of natural gas in the US is today actually lower than it was in the 1960s. Okay, so this is not a new phenomenon at all. I mean, in the 1970s and in the 1980s, the US energy policy screwed up. I'm sorry for the political inquiry, but really, it was a.
It's true.
It's really a textbook. It's really a textbook study for undergraduate economists of what not to do. And after that 20 years, the US, compared to its resource base of natural gas, had an abnormally low utilization of natural gas. So now that the policy is reasonable again, it is not surprising at all that natural gas is growing very rapidly, and it still has a long way to go. I think what is more interesting, I think if you take the geological resource base of gas and coal in the United States, it is pretty clear for me that the US domestically will not burn it. So the US will either export a lot of gas, or the US will export a lot of coal, or a lot of this resource will stay underground forever.
I'd make a couple of comments. Number one, I'm not sure we have an energy policy today. I think it's the market, and I think that's a very important distinction. The market has driven the move toward coal, not energy policy. And second, I think eventually, I have this naive sense of politics that says eventually policy has to work, and that the economics can't be ignored forever. And so I think a lot of our energy policy, if you want to call it that, with this emphasis on renewables and doing things which make no economic sense, is going to probably hit the skids here. We're not in a position as a country, or most states, or even most major cities, where we can afford to subsidize much of anything. And I think eventually you're going to start to see a return to utility commission's old mandate of providing low-cost energy to consumers. And low-cost energy means that you're going to have a balance of coal and natural gas. You're not going to see a willy-nilly shift to natural gas. It'll be much more reasoned, and it'll make sense relative to the transmission lines, which are really the constraint on the system.
Next question. Yes, there in the back. Is that Gary? Yeah.
Thank you. Gary Kronstein with Kroll's Bond Rating Agency. Two questions for the panel. First, you mentioned many times that the killer app was the conversion of this abundant cheap natural gas to a liquefied fuel. Do any of you have a current cost estimate convertible to, say, dollars per gallon as to what current technology or near expected technology would be able to convert natural gas into a liquefied fuel in the U.S.? And two, and slightly on a different vein, the technology that we've used in the past 3 or 4 years that have greatly expanded the production of natural gas and lowered its cost, is this technology not available or not usable in Europe and Asia? Is our geology in North America so radically different that we should not anticipate increased production of domestic natural gas in China and in Europe?
I'll take the first shot at that, and
Sure.
Laszlo, you kind of correct me where I'm wrong. I think it is absolutely transferable. I think there are lots of issues why it's delayed. It's going to take a little longer than it's taken in the U.S. It starts with basic knowledge of the subsurface. In much of Europe, there's very little understanding of what's under the surface, and whereas in the United States, even a place like the Eagleford or the Marcellus, people knew there was gas there. They just didn't realize how much, and and the new technology allowed them to harvest much more than they originally expected. I think that's a big factor over there. I think second, you've got regulatory issues that the state owns the subsurface minerals, and so there's a perception. It was interesting, Laszlo and I were talking last night. I was with some guys yesterday, and their perception, these are knowledgeable characters, their perception is that the government owns all the resource, and so somebody coming in developing the resource isn't going to ever own it. That actually, in our discussion last night, it's not correct, but that's the perception in the producing community. And then third, it takes time. I mean, there was a lot of press about the Exxon's poor wells in Poland a couple or 3 weeks ago, and everybody said, well, this is an indication that that's not going to work. When you go back and you look at what has happened in every shale play out there, the first wells are not very good. It takes, in some cases, 2-3 years of playing around in that subsurface and with different fracking approaches and different drilling efforts to get to the right formula, which then releases significant hydrocarbon. This is not a quick process, and over there, I think it'll take time. There's shale in China, there's shale in Russia, there's shale in Africa. It's all over the place, and that's one of the reasons why I think the world will look a lot different in 2025 than it does today. You'll see a whole lot more gas consumed than anybody's imagining today, enough to make a lot of the LNG supply and demand models that are available in the industry, I suspect are going to look pretty silly in 10 or 15 years.
Don't forget that the northern Texas, where the revolution started, had already been a globally important cluster of conventional oil and gas production for 100 years. So everything was there, all the skilled labor, the equipment, the service companies, everything. I was involved in my previous job with non-commercial exploration in eastern Hungary. We had to charter cargo planes to fly in heavy equipment one by one from Houston for every test well, because there was not a single piece of that equipment in Europe. That's a quite expensive way of operation. If you want to develop and produce a major shale play, you have to drill and fracture, let's say, 1,000 times. Last year, the Polish oil and gas industry drilled 24 wells. The capability of the upstream service industry have to be scaled up by a factor of 10 to make it happen. Now, actually, Schlumberger relocated their European headquarters to Bucharest, Romania, which tells you a lot how optimistic they are about shale gas in Eastern Europe. So this ramping up of the service sector capability, this will happen, but it will take a lot of time.
The second question was on the economics of GTLs, right? Yes. Can you address that, Porter? Or?
Well, I can talk about one chart that I've seen, and I was trying to remember the numbers that were on it. It looked that it was based on a rate of return, and if you had 350 gas and I want to say 375 diesel, you were well over a 12% rate of return on the investment. So it's, those numbers are somewhere in that area for gas to liquids aimed at the diesel market, not at the gasoline market.
I think we have time for one more question. We're going to stop promptly at 9:45, and then we'll have a 10-minute break. So how about right up here in the front, Debbie? Thank you.
Question, someone mentioned earlier.
Can you introduce yourself,
Oh, I'm
please?
so sorry. Liz Peek. I'm a columnist with Fox News and the Fiscal Times. What is the cost of turning on the scrubbers? I think someone mentioned earlier that China has all that equipment, and they just, is it, so that's one question.
Yeah.
This is, I know, the last question. Are utilities changing their contracting approach because of this increased desire for flexibility? Have we seen any impact on the market?
Yeah, good questions, both of them. First of all, the cost to turn on a scrubber, what you're really doing is you're bringing in limestone, and you're taking a little more power cost. So it's a mere fraction. It's call it an extra $1 to $2 a megawatt hour to run a scrubber. It's not meaningfully more. $1 to $2 a megawatt hour is, a tenth of a cent, 2/10 of a cent at most. Because you also then got to store the scrubber stuff once you're done with it. So it's minimal, but it also takes a little efficiency hit. And if you're not told to do it, as you weren't told in China, why do it? And many of those utilities were struggling for profit margin. Let's see, the utility contracting practice, yeah, it's changing. And part of it is because now their volumes, they used to know, coal's a base load plant, I know exactly how much or within a bandwidth. Now, because of price volatility on the gas side, it could be a swing of 20, 30%. So you will contract more to the minimum levels and leave yourself open on the spot market to buy more. And if you don't ever need it, you don't buy it. Where that really is impacting in the U.S. coal industry, and this is important if you look around, it's really in the eastern part of the U.S. more than what I'll call the Midwest is driven by Powder River Basin. The eastern part driven by the West Virginia, West Kentucky, those costs for that coal is much higher than the Powder River Basin being delivered to Illinois and those areas. So you're seeing a tremendously different profile and impacts in the east than you are in the central and the west. And its price point, as gas moves back up, slightly up, the coal plants in the central part come under a lot less pressure. The plants in the southeast that are driven off the Cap Basin, they're out of the money. They're just not cost effective under any scenario until you get gas to about $4. So that's
on a global level, the global swing supplier of coal, which is playing the role as the excess capacity of Saudi Arabia in oil. The global sink supplier of coal is the Eastern United States. So one of the biggest open question for coal is to what extent China will succeed in ramping up coal production in the new coal mining areas in the northern and western parts of the country, where there is an awful lot of coal, but it's also a very difficult remote region. And we run our models asking the question that what if the Chinese don't succeed in ramping up rapidly production? And the biggest change by far is in the net trade position of the United States. That's where the coal will come if China mines less domestically. And that also means that the Eastern United States will be increasingly integrated to the global coal market. That global coal market is becoming more liquid and more financialized. There is an increasing degree of financial trade in coal. Futures contracts are being launched. OTC trade is developing. It is nowhere near the oil commodity market, but it is becoming a more efficient, more liquid market.
Robert, I just have one kind of follow-up question. I was curious whether the increase in rail traffic associated with oil is impacting the ability of utilities to negotiate coal contracts with railroads.
It's an interesting thing in the Western railroads because the Western railroads, the BN and the UP, for most don't know, those two railroads move all the Powder River Basin coal. Powder River Basin coal is essentially 50% of the U.S. coal is moved by those two railroads from Campbell County, Wyoming, to the rest of the United States and the world. So if there's any reduction there in terms of in movements, that hurts them. One of the two railroads will say, well, we're moving oil out of the Bakken play, out of North Dakota, down, because there's not the Keystone Pipeline or anything like it. So the railroad that's moving that is doing wonderfully well because they're moving oil, and normally that would not be happening. And when the Keystone Pipeline comes in, that revenue stream will go away. The BN, I believe, is that particular railroad that is up there, that's owned by Warren Buffett. And so the Keystone Pipeline, when it comes in, it removes a significant revenue stream that the BN touts as being great today. And then they'll say, I really want that coal moved back, any coal moves back. So it's an interesting dynamic that's going on at the moment.
It's what makes it even more interesting is that oil that if Keystone is built, that will definitely alleviate some of that traffic. Yeah. The question is whether it'll get picked up south of there out of the Niobrara, because we don't have the ability to move all that crude either. So this is a dynamic that's going to be interesting to watch.
The Niobrara is another shale play that's just now coming on stream. So let's take about a 7-minute break. Jacob had his presentation was made available, but we didn't have enough copies. We're going to get a digital copy. If you want a color copy, give us your email and we'll make sure and get you one. Please join me in a round of applause for our panel.
I think it is clear how fortunate we are to believe in the power of ideas.
Supply the common sense and the fresh thinking to the Manhattan Institute.